What's up guys? This week we've got questions on manual gearboxes coming back into Formula One, Rotary Engines coming back to Formula One. We've got questions around the Formula One industry's fight back against this global health pandemic and what Formula One might be able to do to help. How will the whole thing impact us as an industry moving forward? What will the season or the teams or the infrastructure of F1 look like when all this is finally over? Loads and loads of great questions. Welcome back to a fresh week, fresh haircut, fresh video. Right, welcome back folks, as I say. A couple of things before we get going. I reckon Mrs P did a pretty decent job on the old Barnet, don't you? Secondly, let me just clear up a couple of things with the Jaguar I-Pace video that I put out on Thursday. That video was filmed well before any of the UK strict lockdown measures that we're currently experiencing came into place. So I wasn't breaking any rules, I wasn't putting myself or anybody at unnecessary risk. I was following all of the government guidelines, as I have been all the way through, being as responsible as I can be. It's just that the video went live during the lockdown measures. It was filmed long before they came in. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I just want to make it clear that I am a massive fan. I mean, most of you know this. I'm a huge fan of electric cars and their technology. I mean, most of you on this channel have heard me banging on about them for years now. So that video was certainly not supposed to be a downer on electric cars. You know, I had some issues with the charging process, which are not unique to me. I've had some of those issues in the past. I know lots of other people that have had them too. My feeling on this is that I'm frustrated because the car technology is impressive. It's incredible on so many levels. It's just that for certain issues, for certain use cases, we don't have an infrastructure that's good enough or reliable enough yet to support that and build people's confidence in it. That was the point of the video. So certainly don't want to say that electric cars are no good or are no use to people. They absolutely are. I mean, I was literally on the brink of buying one before this whole coronavirus thing kicked in. So I'm a huge fan. So please don't let that put you off considering an electric car. It's just a thing to highlight and to take into consideration, you know, when you're looking at whatever kind of use case lots of people use them for. Most people, of course, wake up every single morning having charged it up overnight with a full battery, and it has more than enough range to get them through the entire day. Right, let's crack on with the questions and start with this one from Anko on YouTube. He says, with several F1 teams starting to produce ventilators, in what areas do you expect them to do a better job designing and producing ventilators than the current designers and production plants do? And do you think F1 teams will learn things with this experience that they can use in their production facilities once we're focused on racing again? Also, do those F1 teams do this out of charity, or is it considered business and reducing costs? So first of all, let's just have a big round of applause please for Formula One as an industry, and Mercedes are in the headlines this morning for having a design that they've reverse engineered alongside the University College of London, which has been approved and therefore will go into production to help save many lives, I'm sure, in this fight back against the coronavirus. So a massive round of applause for all those involved that have managed to get this thing off the ground and mobilise themselves so quickly. And that, Anko, is where I'm going to answer your question, because what Formula One is able to do, Formula One teams are able to do, is mobilise themselves quickly. They are absolute experts in rapid engineering solutions and making those rapid engineering solutions incredibly reliable. You know, in the wider world, in the normal world, if you like, things like this would take months, if not years, to first of all be designed and then developed, but then be tested, you know, over and over again to get these things approved and built to a level that they can build them not only within budget, but also that are going to be reliable enough, of course, dependable enough to be used in the healthcare system. Formula One is able to do that incredibly quickly. First of all, because they're not restricted by the financial restraints that the healthcare industry probably is. Also, of course, some of these restrictions will have been relaxed a little bit to try and rush through these kind of systems because of what's going on in the world right now. But most importantly, what Formula One does is operate very quickly. We have to have a completely different mindset to the rest of the world. I know this from working in a Formula One team, and then if you ever try and subcontract anything out outside of your own team, The real world works on a very different timescale. Whereas Formula One has the mentality that, right, we've got to get it done by this deadline, so let's do whatever it takes. We'll throw people at it, we'll throw money at it, resources at it. We'll use the very best equipment. And that's what Formula One can do. So in terms of these ventilators or this equipment, they've taken an existing design, taken it apart, reverse engineered it to a point where they think they can produce a similar effect in terms of the overall result, but do it more quickly, do it more reliably, make it simpler. That's what will enable us to make thousands of these units every single week that will feed into the healthcare system and make such a big difference for us. As businesses, we're flexible enough to adapt very quickly because, of course, we're having to adapt every week in Formula One. I did a video about exactly this the other day, didn't I? In the real world, if you like, you set yourself up to manufacture something, and that manufacturing run will probably be the same for, well, maybe years. In Formula One, we're not manufacturing anything the same for years. We're manufacturing things for days or weeks at the most before it's then outdated and updated, outdeveloped. So we are very, very used to adapting and changing what we do, how we do it, to make something better, more efficient, more dependable, and sometimes simple is the best way to do that. Are they doing it for free? No. Governments have commissioned outside industry to take on this fight. So Formula One teams and many of the other industries that are getting involved in this, they're not doing it for free, they're doing it because that's what the government needs, and the government are very willing to pay. And from a Formula One point of view, we're in tough times as well. So any of these industries that can switch their manufacturing process over to helping the fight back against this coronavirus that the government are willing to commission, well, that's a win-win for everybody. Robin says, "Hi Mark, what are your thoughts on the idea of bringing back manual gearboxes into F1? Perhaps it could make racing more exciting due to the different driving style that it takes." Well Robin, whilst there's definitely a part of me that would love to see that, you know, a bit more old school racing where we connect the driver back to the mechanics of the car a little bit, you know, where they don't just click a switch but they have to manually, physically grapple with a gear shift lever and shove it into gear at so many points around the lap. You know, there's a big part of me, a nostalgic part of me, you know, probably like you, that would love to see that. And you're absolutely right, it's a very different driving style required to drive a car like that fast. However, I'm also a huge fan of technology, as you know, and the technology that's gone into modern Formula One seamless shift gearboxes, for me, is mind-blowing. And it's an area of development that I'm really interested to see how much further it can go. You know, I'm a big fan of technology on these cars. I don't really feel like we should be taking steps backwards. You know, it's one of these things a little bit like the sort of V8 or V10 engines. I absolutely loved them, don't get me wrong. You know, being part of a pit stop when there was a V10 screaming away at 21,000 RPM, literally, you know, a foot away from where you're sitting, was the most incredible experience. I can't even begin to describe it properly. So I'm a huge fan of all of that. The nostalgia, the sound of these cars screaming around the back of a circuit at such high pitch. I mean, I love all of that, but we're not going to be going back to it. And for me, it's not, we shouldn't be going back to it. It's old school F1. It was great whilst it lasted. It's something we should celebrate and never let go of. But I don't think it's something we should be going back to. We should be celebrating what technology we have now, the incredible effort, the engineering effort that's gone into that, and being excited about where on earth this technology could potentially take us in the future. Matteo Gritti says, "Hi Mark, I was watching some Rotary Engine videos and stumbled across Liquid Pistons, a company that applied the rotary technology very efficiently. Do you think that this technology could have a future in motorsport?" Well, that's quite interesting, isn't it? As you know, I've done videos on this already, but Formula One is looking potentially at its next big power unit change. What will the next version of the F1 power unit look like? We've talked about two-stroke engines. Could rotary engines form a part of that? Well, there are a couple of things. Rotary engines have great potential. Historically, they're not very efficient in terms of, you know, they use a lot of fuel to get their power. And that's not really the direction that Formula One wants to go. But I totally agree with you. There are now some companies that have made, a bit like with two-stroke engines, have made huge advances in terms of the efficiency levels of these units. So maybe if we put that technology under Formula One development process, perhaps we could get to some incredible efficiency levels like we've done with the 4-stroke combustion engine. The other problem though with those things is that they, whilst they're very small and lightweight, which is great, and we can get some really high revving engines out of those which could sound awesome, one of the other issues, and this may not be a sort of showstopper, but a Formula 1 engine right now is what we call a stressed member of the car. So it's bolted directly to the back of the chassis, the gearbox is bolted directly to the back of the engine, and the whole thing takes the torsional loads that go through the car all the way around the lap. To do that with a rotary engine becomes a lot more difficult, just simply because of its very nature, the way it's constructed. Now, it may well be that you could do something around that. You could build some kind of frame that could do the job of that. So that's not the end of the world. So I don't think it's out of the question that Formula 1 could consider a rotary engine for something like its next power unit. My feeling is that it's more likely to go down something like a 2-stroke route, or even remain with 4 strokes, just using different kinds of fuel technology. But it's definitely something that should be looked at and talked about, and I'm fairly certain that Formula 1, Pat Simmons and his team will probably be doing just that. Stuart Keith asks this one. So the teams have to use their chassis next season. What happens with Mercedes? DAS is banned for next season, so what happens with their chassis? Right, well, a few people have asked this kind of question. Now, next year, what was going to be the new technical regs for 2021 specifically outlawed the use of a DAS system, didn't it? The wording was put in to make sure that teams wouldn't be able to use that. But those regulations that were intended for 2021 have now been pushed back to 2022. But they're all part of the same 2021, or what were the 2021 technical regs. So for next year, for 2021, we're essentially going to be using a version still to be 100% decided on of the 2020 regs. Now in the 2020 regs, there's no specific wording outlawing the use of a DAS system. So potentially we could still have a chance to use it next year. What we never got to see though was if Mercedes used this in a competitive session, for example at the Australian Grand Prix, would somebody like Red Bull have protested them? And if they had protested them, what would the race stewards have decided? Would they have decided that it breached some kind of technical regulation? Those are the questions that everybody never really got the answers to, and therefore that really has some bearing on whether anybody will want to use DAS in 2021. But as things stand, there's nothing stopping Mercedes using the same chassis that they were going to use for 2020 in 2021, including the DAS system on board. And on the same subject, Getoa says, "Hi Mark, as the start of the first race is going to take time, will this give teams enough time to create the DAS system?" And that's the other part of this question. So given that we've got this big delay, is there an opportunity for everybody else to start using or creating their own version of DAS? And the answer to that is, well, yes, there's definitely time now. That's what everybody has in abundance to some extent. The big problem and the big unanswered question is it worth doing? First of all, is it worth doing because is the resulting advantage from it significant enough to justify the expense and investment that goes into it? But even more so, because we never saw it used in Australia, and therefore we never saw this predicted complaint, this predicted protest, and therefore we never got the result of that protest, nobody really knows if it would actually be allowed to be raced. What happened was the FIA gave an opinion to Mercedes during their development phase, saying that in their opinion they couldn't see why it would breach any regulations. But when it comes to it, it's the race stewards that have to make that call, not the FIA technical department. And therefore, if somebody invests time, money and energy into developing a system like that, which is no small feat, it could get to whenever our first race ends up being, and then it could get protested, and then it could get banned. So that's the unanswered question. That's the difficult thing that teams are having to decide right now. No doubt they're all evaluating it, but how many, if any, will actually push the button on production when we get going again? Right, just realised that was probably really windy out there, so I hope you can hear what I was saying. Anyway, back home and a couple of things. First of all, I had an epic parenting fail last week. Claire and I completely confused with what day of the week things are, as I'm sure lots of you are. thought it was the end of the school term and told our children that it was school holidays on Friday evening, only to realise we're a week early and had to come back and tell them that actually they got another week of homeschool. This isn't homeschool, by the way, this is lunch break. We're pushing them pretty hard, but we're being fair as well. Anyway, so that was a bit of a mess up, and hopefully they've forgiven us. But on the subject of kids, thank you to all of you that have sent in videos with questions for the Ask Elvis Kids special. I'm hoping to do that next Monday. I've got loads of them coming through, really awesome. So thanks for those. If you sent me one, I've emailed you back a release form. I've got most of those signed and back as well, so we're almost good to go, but there's still time. So if you still would like your child to ask a question on anything around Formula One or cars, as cute, as silly, as funny, as awkward, as weird, as difficult as you like, send them in to the email address on the bottom of the screen there. Do it in landscape mode, and when I receive it, I will email you back with a release form that you need to sign just to give me permission to use it. But it could be included in next week's video. So I'm really looking forward to it. I think it's going to be a really nice thing to do, and maybe it could be the start of something bigger we'll do in the future. So thanks for those. Right, let's crack on with more questions. Right, here we go. We're going to pick up from up here in the treehouse. If you follow me on Instagram, you'll have seen that I was up here over the weekend, finished a couple of bits. I actually finished this off last summer. I just forgot to kind of mention it to you guys in a video, but the kids have been enjoying it whilst the weather's been nice, and I've also been enjoying it. And I'm up here because it's one of very few places right now where I can get some quiet to record a video whilst everyone else is in the house. So perhaps I'll show you around the treehouse in another video in a bit more depth, talk you through the process, but right now let's carry on with some of these questions, because Dave Horwell asks this one. He says, the potential financial state of the car industry following the coronavirus. Could we see teams fold and manufacturers pull out protecting businesses? Aston Martin nearly folded before Stroll, Renault's being state-owned, and Daimler pulling Mercedes' massive budget. You're absolutely right. These are worrying times, and there are some of those teams and people and industries and entities within Formula One that are probably not going to come out the other side of this unscathed. There probably is a very high possibility we could lose a Formula One team or two. That's not just a threat, that's not just a headline, that's a reality. And you know, we can look at Formula One because that's what we're all focused on, but in the wider world, that's going to be happening everywhere. Businesses are going to be collapsing, folding left, right and centre. Formula One's not immune to that. Formula One, you know, is in a precarious state, has been for a few years, reliant on a couple of manufacturers to prop up the sport. If we were to lose one of the big teams, one of the big manufacturers of our sport, you know, that has more serious consequences, because we could lose the engine supply to potentially quite a large chunk of the grid. So Formula One's in a difficult, precarious situation like the rest of the world, but as we're focused on this sport, you're absolutely right, we could well see some of these teams not make it through. F1 Fan View says, hi Mark, love the show, thank you very much. How do you think the rules delay will impact Stroll and Aston Martin? Presumably they'll be running a chassis with a different name to the team. And could copying Marc backfire if they have to run extra races, if they struggle to develop? Well, when it comes to the chassis name, absolutely right. They could well end up running a chassis name that's different to the team name, but it won't really cause them any problems. That's just a branding thing. They'll still rebrand the team as Aston Martin, and that's what everybody will know that car as. It'll be an Aston Martin car. When it comes to their development potential, you're absolutely right, because not only are we expecting to perhaps get some races in 2020, but the same car will roll over into 2021, where presumably it will do a full standard season, if you like. That means that that particular car will have to do more races than would have ever been planned for it, assuming we get more than a standard season, assuming we get something in this year. And because it's essentially a copy of the concept that Mercedes used last year, the development potential of that car could well be limited. So you're absolutely right, they might find themselves in a situation where they've got limited scope for development. But here's the thing. Given that they may well be at a much greater starting point than they otherwise would have been if they'd gone down the route that they were originally planning with their own car, well, perhaps they're going to be way further up the grid anyway. So even starting in the top 4 or 5 of the grid at the start of the season, if your development potential is still limited, that performance advantage will carry you some way through the season anyway. So overall, they might still be better off. Liam West says, if you collected all the parts an F1 team makes during a season, how many Liam, I know exactly what you mean here, but I'm going to read it as you've written it. How many cats could they build theoretically? Well, answers on a postcard. How many cats could a Formula 1 team build? So, if you collected all the parts of an F1 team that they make during a season, how many cars could they theoretically build? Obviously there's a limited amount of power units, so assuming a car's valid without a power unit and gearbox, as those can be switched, I assume. Okay, well I'm going to assume you meant cars and not cats. But when it comes to cars, you're always limited in that sense. If you wanted to, if what you're saying is how many could you build and line up in a row over the course of a season, you're always limited by the chassis, because the chassis, which is the safety cell, the monocoque, the bit the driver sits in essentially, that's the bit that typically has fewest components made. Mainly because it's hugely expensive, it's big, it's complicated, it has to be crash tested by the FIA as well, and also they don't tend to wear out unless you slam them into a wall somewhere. So typically an F1 team these days will probably make somewhere between 4 and 6 chassis, and that will mean one of those will be crash tested to pass the FIA tests and therefore destroyed and never raced. You'll then have the 2 cars that will be in Australia for the very first Grand Prix, the 2 race cars. You'll also have a spare chassis tucked away in a box in case of any major disasters, and then gradually over the season you might roll out 1 or 2 more, particularly if you have an accident, if you have some incident where a chassis is destroyed. So let's say there's probably a maximum of 5 or 6 chassis being created. With that in mind, you can't create more than 5 or 6 cars, even if you laid every single component out that an F1 team makes. Beyond that, of course, lots of components are made to different levels because of the use case for them, the service life. Things like brakes, there's an endless supply. They're going through them in, like no tomorrow. Uprights, there'll be quite a few because they'll need constant servicing, so they'll be cycled through the system, whereas another set of uprights can go onto the car, while another set, the old set, go into the sub-assembly department to be refurbished. So every component that an F1 team makes, they build just about the right number of those to be able to use them, to be able to cycle through them, their service life, and of course to have some spares built up in the truck or in the freight. But the biggest limiting factor would always be the chassis. So I guess the answer to your question about cars not cats would be, I suspect you could probably only ever build a maximum of 5 or 6 cars at the end of a season once you've made everything. Okay, to finish this video off, we're going to take this, which is a great question from Chris over on the Seedstream app. And Chris says, since many of the drivers are turning to home gaming simulators, it made me wonder, if a driver really wanted, could they have a full manufacturer-built rig at home? Top-running drivers surely have the cash. Using the McLaren simulator as an example, I'd like to know the following. How much computing power does it take to run the rig? Is telemetry a second machine? What electrical consumption's involved? What about physical footprint? Are they designed by McLaren's race team, or are they usually third-party contractors? What are they even worth? Right, quite a few questions in there, Chris. Thank you very much for those. Now, a few things. First of all, a lot of those questions you've mentioned there are not really too much of a consideration when it comes to a driver having one at home. Most of these simulators, certainly what they call the driver in the loop simulator, the bit where the driver actually sits in and drives the thing, because there is another type of simulation tool that Formula 1 teams use which doesn't require a driver. It's literally using CFD, computational fluid dynamics, where they input data and run a simulation and then get some results back. That's in fact the most common form of simulation in Formula 1 teams. The driver in the loop situation is when they put a driver inside a simulator and you see them driving with a screen in front of them. That, of course, is possible to have at home. Many drivers have their own versions of that on a consumer level. To have a manufacturer rig, first of all, isn't really worthwhile. The space that it takes up is pretty big, and that's only really because in a Formula One team they have a room dedicated to it. It has a full F1 chassis in there so that it's as realistic as possible. The entire room is a wraparound screen, which is obviously huge as well, but that's also just to get a more immersive experience from the simulator. The real reason for the simulator is for the teams to input the data, the changes on the car that they want to make, setup changes, component changes, and then get some driver feedback on it. You could have a very similar system, but on a much smaller scale. So you could have the same physics, the software, you could have that running on a much smaller consumer-based system and still get some form of feedback that a driver could then report back into a team. So it can work in that level. In terms of computing power, you'll be very surprised, I'm sure some of you, to know that a lot of the physics engines that these things use are actually based on open source software or consumer grade software. A lot of the teams, I mean, even up until in fact, a lot of the teams are still using it, is the rFactor Pro platform. Some teams have moved on to others and bespoke types now, but rFactor Pro is something that you and I can go and buy, but it has the capability to be controlled from an outside source. Because it's open source, teams can then input their own data, they can input their own tyre model or their own chassis model, and that's what makes it absolutely bespoke to them. So the software that runs these things is really the differentiator. That's the thing. These systems are only as good as the data, like everything, as the data you input into them as to what you get out. So in answer to your question, Chris, yes, it's absolutely possible that a driver could have a kind of full-blown manufacturer rig set up at home. The truth, though, is that I'm not sure it would be too much of a benefit. It would be a great gaming experience for them. I don't think it's worth the investment and the input and the disruption to get anything out of it from a team's perspective, certainly not from a driver perspective. In terms of what they're worth, well, it's an unanswerable question, really. It's worth as much as you as a team put into it. And that means that you can have a full motion rig with a chassis that moves around, and some of the sims that I've driven have been incredible in terms of the experience they give you, from simulating temporary G-forces through seat packs that inflate and deflate very quickly to simulate the movement on your body, the chassis moving around on hydraulic rigs, even hydraulic linkages hooked up to your crash helmet that simulate the G-forces on your neck going around a corner. Amazing experiences, but probably not something that an F1 driver needs to give the feedback that a team requires from his time in a simulator. The thing that makes these kind of tools valuable to an F1 team, and of course on to a driver in the end as well, is the quality of the data that goes into it. How accurate is the model of things like tyres and chassis and aero? So when you make a change on your system, on your computer, how accurately does that impact the experience of being in the car? Those things are not necessarily related to how expensive your chassis is or how great your screen is or anything like that, how good your sound system is. Those are all things that improve the experience and the immersive feel of being in a simulator. But the value to a team is all around the data. How accurately can you model what it is you want to try and test in there? And that's where all of the work goes in a modern F1 simulator. Right, I hope that answers your question as best I can. There were loads more, so I'm sorry if I didn't get to yours this week. Keep them coming though, because I will try and answer them online, as I always try and do. And of course, keep them rolling in. Always use #AskElvis, and I will find them one way or the other. Next week, really looking forward to this kids version of the Ask Elvis show. As I said before, if you'd still like to send in a video for that, I'd really appreciate it. We've got space for more, so please do fire them in. I'll pop the email address in the description of the video, and all instructions to do it. Very, very simple. Do that, I'd really appreciate it. And either way, I've got some great ones, so looking forward to that video coming your way soon. I will be back over the coming days with more stuff, but as ever, anything you want to know, anything you want me to discuss or investigate for you or try and explain, fire it in on any of my social platforms or right here on YouTube, and I'll do my very best. In the meantime, stay safe guys, look after each other, and I'll see you soon. Ta-ra.